Leonardo DiCaprio won his Academy Award starring in the movie The Revenant, based on the best-selling novel by author Michael Punke. Michael's my guest this week on Guys TV. We're going to talk about his new book, Ridgeline. It all starts right here on Guys TV right now. You can also catch me on KCAA Radio every Wednesday evening in Southern California and on my worldwide podcast, Guys Radio. Guys TV, Guys Radio, thanks for your support. Okay, Guys Radio, this is my favorite portion of the show where I get to interview and talk to and learn from some really cool people. Since this is show number, I think it's going to be 488. That means I must have interviewed and spoken to over 600 people over the last couple of years, and I've learned a lot. And I've got a great guest today. You know, I love novels, and it's so tough to write a book and write a good story. And I love it when I get a really good novelist on here. And he's written one of my favorite books and a fantastic movie that was made of it. It's called The Revenant. His name is Michael Punke. He's got a new book. It's called Ridgeline. Let me tell you a little bit about Michael and a little bit about the new book, and then we'll get into it. So Michael's the author of the novel, The Revenant, which was made into an Oscar-winning movie with Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Hardy. It was a #1 bestseller. And Michael has served in the U.S. as a U.S. ambassador for the World Trade Organization in Geneva. He's been a history correspondent for the Montana Quarterly and adjunct professor at University of Montana. He worked summers in high school, a living history interpreter for Fort Laramie National Historic Site in Wyoming. He lives with his family in Montana. He's an avid outdoorsman. So welcome to Guys Radio, Michael Punke.
Thanks, Robert. I'm excited to be here.
All right, let's get into the new book. What inspired you to choose? The name of the book is called Ridgeline, and it's about a kind of a mashup out in a similar area near where Custer's last stand was, or the greasy fight, or whatever they called it there. But basically, greasy grass. The settlers came out there, and they wanted to kind of plunk down and build a fort and settle right in the middle of some native hunting grounds. And that didn't go over well with Crazy Horse and Red Cloud and a bunch of others. So what was your inspiration to pick this historical story, if you will, the Fetterman fight, as the subject for the book? You know, it's a less personal story than The Revenant. How'd you kind of come up with this?
Well, the starting point for me is I love stories that are based on things that really happened. And the event that you described, the underlying event, which the book culminates in a battle, is just hugely dramatic to me and interesting. And on top of that, I thought that it tied into some really important, broader themes that were about things that were going on in the country at the time, but also that are frankly still relevant today. And then lastly, it just has great characters. You mentioned Crazy Horse, Red Cloud. Jim Bridger, who was a character in The Revenant, shows up in real life as an old man in this story. So it just kind of had all the elements for me.
You know, when I was found myself, when I was reading the book, I wasn't sure who to root for. I was torn, and I'm wondering if you did that on purpose for the reader, or you were torn while you were writing it, because, you know, there's the pioneering spirit of the settlers and the cavalry, and it's our government and it's our army and all of that. And then you have the Native American tribes, which they were inhabiting and risking losing their native lands, mostly to broken promises by the U.S. government and army. What were your feelings when you were crafting the story? Were you empathetic at all to the settlers as well as the Native Americans?
Well, the story is told mostly from the perspective, or I would say primarily the lead characters is Crazy Horse. And so it's told predominantly from the standpoint of Native Americans. That said, as you point out, there's a broad cast, and it includes a lot of important figures from real life on the side of the U.S. cavalry. And I did not feel unambiguous about or let me say it differently. I did feel ambiguous about some of the cavalrymen in particular, who I think were not out there seeking to conquer the native tribes. I think some of them were there out of a sense of duty, and kind of found themselves caught up in a situation that they probably didn't agree with. That wasn't all of them by any stretch of the imagination, but I think, as in any group of humans, there's a spectrum in terms of motivations.
It seems to me that our Native Americans and all the tribes, they were a very, very special group of people within the history and context of the entire world and civilizations, and that they were very respectful to the land. They had their own rivalries, but there was a purity to the way they lived. And it's such a shame that they've been treated the way they have. What are your feelings about the tribes and the Native Americans and really their place in not just the history of the United States and the West, but in terms of humanity and our planet?
Well, since I was a little boy, I've been fairly obsessed with Native American history. I grew up in Wyoming, and as you mentioned, I now live in Montana. And so, of course, the Native tribes are a part of the entire American history, but they're very much a part of the history in the places where I've grown up. And so I've always been obsessed with that history in a lot of ways. What comes through really profoundly to me in the story that I tell in this book is just the raw injustice of what was done to the tribes as part of that westward American expansion. And as you point out, there's a lot of heroic people who were involved in that westward expansion, and the bravery of those settlers and of many of those soldiers, I think, is something that it's not hard to find in history, but that came at an incredible cost to the people who were already living here. And in the case of this incident, it came in the face of a very explicit violation of a treaty that had been entered into between the US government and the Native tribes. And of course, that is a theme that we see throughout Western history.
Why do you think that is, Michael? My guest, Michael Punke, on Guys Radio, we're talking about his new book, Ridgeline, a follow-up to The Revenant, completely different story, though, that the Indians kind of got, Native Americans, excuse me, got screwed over really by the US government. So many treaties were broken. Was it because the government always changes hands in terms of who's kind of running the show? And is it in the handoff where there are problems, or with this just inevitable that the expansion of the country is just going to blow right through the West?
I think there is some inevitability to it, in the sense that people talk about manifest destiny. And when you break that term down, what it means: manifest, obvious, destiny, what's going to happen in the future. And I think as a country, the United States was going to continue to expand from east to west as more and more people came to the continent. And so I think usually when treaties were made with various tribes, it was with a view towards pushing them away from some new place that the US government wanted to open up for white settlement. And as the years progress, and as the number of settlers moving westward increased, and in the case of the middle of the 19th century increased dramatically, there became less and less places for people to go. And the convenient thing for the US government to do, and the politically expedient thing for the US government to do, was to break treaties that they had made with peoples who were politically powerless and move them aside. And that is absolutely the pattern that you see time and time again throughout US history. At the same time, when it comes to the Plains Indians, you have a people and a culture and an economy that is built around the notion of wide open spaces where they can wander as nomadic tribes following the buffalo. So their whole economy and culture required massive amounts of land. And ultimately, those two things just came into irreconcilable conflict.
Now, I think a lot of people don't understand there's so many different tribes. It's not like everybody got along and all the Native Americans were one big happy family. There was the Sioux and the Crow and the Shoshone and the Apache, and there was like so many different tribes and so many different rivalries. How did you learn about that? And what did you learn when you got into really diving into the individual tribes and their kind of profiles, if you will?
Well, to pick up on your point, I guess what I really learned a lot is just about the complexity of Indigenous American culture. And as you point out, there are hundreds of tribes, and even in just this part of the Great Plains in which this story takes place, there are dozens of tribes, and they had their own complex historic relationships with each other, some of which were in conflict. And that was one of the things, frankly, that the U.S. government and the U.S. Army was able to exploit. And one of the things that's interesting to me about the story that I tell in Ridgeline is Red Cloud, who's one of the major chiefs of the Lakota, is, I think, under-recognized as a political genius. He's oftentimes recognized as a military genius, but what he did in the fall of 1866 is he pulled together this coalition of tribes that was not accustomed to fighting together. And it was a huge diplomatic coup, and it completely took the US Army by surprise. And it's part of the reason why he was so successful in the incidents that I talk about.
Mm-hmm. Why did you choose what's called the Fetterman fight as your subject matter? The Custer's Last Stand, or the Greasy Grass, if you will, took place a few years later. A lot of that was about the gold that was in their hills, if you will, and this took place before. And it's a very intricate, interesting setup in terms of what led up to the battle. And the way you tell the story, Michael, you did a terrific job, because we get every perspective. We get from the Native Americans, we get the wives of some of the settlers, we get the scouts, we get just an overview of here's how the cavalry behaved and their inner conflicts and all of that. But how did you actually decide upon, I'm going to write about the Fetterman fight?
Well, look, I love the story of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And I've spent a lot of time kind of wandering that battlefield, which is in my home state of Montana. But one of the things I loved about the Fetterman fight is that it is less well known. And so, but it's one of those things, I think, that you read about it and you kind of can't believe you haven't heard of it before, because it's a big fight. It is dramatic in that I won't give all the details, but it doesn't end well for the U.S. cavalry. It occurs at an earlier stage in the history where some of these things are still, it's not quite as apparently inevitable how things are going to turn out. One of the things I love about 1866 is that Crazy Horse, who, as I mentioned, is really the lead protagonist in this book, is still a young man. And for those of us who know a little bit about Crazy Horse, we tend to think of him more 10 years later when he's fighting Custer at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And at that point in his life, he's fully evolved into the person he becomes as both a leader and a human. It's fun in 1866, 10 years earlier, to see him at an earlier stage in his life, where I think he's still making a lot more mistakes, and in many ways seems much more human than he does later on when he almost becomes superhuman. So for all those reasons, I thought it was really fun to focus on this particular incident.
It's a terrific subject matter, and you did a great job. Let's talk a little bit about the strategy. Red Cloud, he is a brilliant guy, and he's kind of the overseer of all the tribes, and he talks to Crazy Horse, who seems to be a volatile young man. He's aggressive. He wants to get after it with the cavalry when he sees they're going to build a fort right in the middle of the hunting ground. So Red Cloud tells him, just kind of pick at them. And throughout the book, the Native Americans and the tribes they get together. They go after some settlers who have some cattle who are a little further ahead of the main group. Then he starts picking off, one by one, different areas where there's vulnerabilities, and really watching. Is that exactly what happened? And how did you research that? It's brilliant.
Well, I did try and have the book be very close to actual history. And of course, it's fiction, it's historical fiction, but for the most part, it follows very closely actual events, including even some of the smaller kind of skirmishes and smaller fights that I talk about over the course of the fall. And as you say, one of the things that makes this story so compelling is that there's this crescendo over a relatively small number of months in the fall of 1866. After the US Army arrives, Red Cloud settles on this strategy of kind of probing, picking away, learning more about his enemy. All of that kind of builds up to this big battle at the end. But I think that what I discovered when I did the research is that the actual things that happened were so compelling that there was a lot that I didn't need to make up. And I'll give you an example. In one of the early fights that you talked about, a small group of Lakota drives off the US Army's cattle herd, a herd of 1,000 cattle that they were relying upon for their food supply. And the way that they did this, the way that the Lakota drives that cattle herd off, is when they approached the herd, there was a small herd of buffalo that was grazing nearby the cattle. And they literally drove the wild buffalo herd into the cattle herd, which stampeded the cattle herd. And that's just the kind of thing that you almost can't make up. And in the case of this story, I didn't have to, because that's how it's described as happening in real life.
Okay, Guys Radio, my special guest is writer Michael Punke. His new book, The Ridgeline, a follow-up. It's a different story, but he wrote The Revenant, which became an Oscar-winning movie. And it must have been such a trip to get where you are right now. So let's talk a little bit more about this book. I really found myself identifying with the Scouts, Bridger and Beckerworth, I think his name was.
Beckworth, right.
Beckworth, and because I saw them as kind of neutral, where they were hired by the cavalry, yet they understood and empathized with the Indian or Native American way of life, if you will. Did you put them into the story to play that role?
So I will again say that one of the convenient things about this story is, to me, a lot of the elements were there as a matter of history, and I didn't have to make them up. Now, there's a lot of the dialogue between Jim Bridger and James Beckworth, for example, that nobody knows what they said, but they were together as a matter of historical fact in the fall of 1866, both scouting for the US Army. They were sent out to do this long reconnaissance voyage to try and discover the position of the tribes. I apologize. I've got to let my dog in.
That's okay.
Stop barking.
Okay. So, guys radio, our special guest, Michael Punke. He's out there in Montana or Wyoming. I'm not sure which. Forgive me, but he's dealing with his own animal. So here we go.
Sorry about that. I have to pay attention to my dog. I live up in the woods, and sometimes when he's barking, there's a bear in the neighborhood. That's not the case today, but I want to make sure. But anyway, talking about Jim Bridger and James Beckworth, the two of them are these icons in American history. And Jim Bridger I had written about in The Revenant. In The Revenant, which takes place 40 years earlier, Jim Bridger is a kid who makes this huge mistake of throwing in his lot with the villain of The Revenant and abandoning Hugh Glass after he's attacked by a grizzly bear. That also happened in real life. But after that kind of infamous incident, Bridger goes on to become known as the King of the Mountain Men. And he has this, he's well regarded. He discovers as he's the first white person to discover the Great Salt Lake. He pioneers all of these important routes that later become essentially the Oregon Trail. He's just a hugely significant character. And Beckworth is another amazing character. He is a former slave. His father was his white owner. His mother was a black slave. His father frees him. And when he's freed as a young man, Beckworth goes out to make his fortune on the frontier and ends up being a part of the same fur trading company that Jim Bridger was a part of. So the two of them essentially have grown up together on the plains during this amazing era in history. And I think they were voices. I mean, on the one hand, they're scouting for the U.S. Army, and they're paid by the U.S. Army to find the tribes and, to help prosecute them militarily. But there are a lot of historical indications that they were giving counsel that was ignored, including, by the way, that the road that was built to the Montana goldfields should not be built through the path that the Army ultimately, where the Army ultimately put it, which is what leads to this conflict and war in the fall of 1866. So I'll cut it off there for the moment, but they are great characters, and it was fun to imagine the conversations they were having together.
Another area I thought that was interesting is when I was reading about the cavalry, you had the colonel who had limited experience, Carrington. I don't think he'd been in any big fights yet. And then you
None.
had Fetterman. And then you had the third guy who was really kind of problematic.
Drummond.
Yes, Grumman. And there was a lot of backbiting, a lot of politics, even between the wives of the leaders. And then there was an illegal still. They were selling alcohol. They were doing all kinds of stuff. The corruption was there right from the beginning. And you didn't see that on the tribal side. They were more about, we want to protect our lands. And then you have the whole issue of, the stampeding of buffalo to just run them off cliffs and stuff. Was this something that was actually true? And was this the white man that did this, where they killed so many buffaloes needlessly just for a couple of skins?
Well, there's a couple of different eras that get caught up, I think, in your question.
Okay.
If you're just talking about the buffalo, in the era of the horse, which is what the 19th century is for Native Americans, I think the Indians are viewed very much as hunting using what were effectively very sustainable methods, where the tribe would follow the herd. They would harvest what they needed. Right. It's well known that how every part of the buffalo was used. There were earlier eras in Native American hunting before the horse, when tribes did drive herds of buffalo over cliffs, because that was the way that they had to hunt that type of large animal. And I'm sure that there was some waste involved in that. That was probably kind of a feast or famine type of methodology. But I apologize, my dog is just really having an issue today.
All right, Michael's getting his dog again, so we're going to hold on that. And we're talking about his book, The Ridgeline, which is just an incredible story about this battle between the native tribes and the settlers out in an area very close to where the Battle of Bighorn took place a few years later. So go ahead. You were talking about so they were sustainable. So I guess my point was, which I didn't make very well, was that there was a corruption that it seemed to be involved in everything that the settlers did. And I was wondering if that also included wasting a lot of buffalo needlessly. But it sounds like,
well,
I'm just tying things together that those didn't necessarily happen that way.
The Army was not. The Army in this story is living off of supplies that they literally had to bring with them. At the same time, though, there are private individuals that are starting to hunt the buffalo in incredibly non-sustainable ways.
Okay.
And what we think of as the buffalo herd being wiped out by commercial hunters hunting only for the hides, that is starting to happen, especially further south where the railroad had come through. So in Kansas, Colorado, the buffalo are already starting to disappear. They have not yet started to disappear from because of white hunting from Wyoming, Montana, because the railroad has not arrived yet, which was necessary to make that whole buffalo economy work for white hunters.
Okay. Why do you think this particular area, which seems to be a little bit north, a little bit out of the way, I could be completely wrong here, had so much historical significance in the opening up of the West, this area here versus south, where I think the railroads were south of this area? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the first transcontinental railroad was certainly south. Well, I think Lewis and Clark, of course, went across Montana because they were following the Missouri River. Okay. And so it's that first highway of the West was the Missouri, and Lewis and Clark were following that, seeking a path to the Pacific. And that same pathway, that network of rivers becomes the pathway for early fur trading and early exploration. And then what's happened right before the incidents in my book is that gold has been discovered in Montana. And that leads to a gold rush, which is the reason for the US Army wanting to have this new road, which essentially spurred off northward of the Oregon Trail and goes up to the gold country in Montana. And that's what then leads to this immediate fight that happens in 1866.
Got it. Okay, Michael Punke, my guest on Guys Radio, the new book, Ridgeline, a novel. It's a terrific story about settlers moving west, running into the local tribes, setting up a fort in the wrong spot at the wrong time, and then the consequences of what happens. And it's a great story, beautiful writing. I remember one particular passage where you described the difference in how the grass changes in September versus the summer. It's just beautiful writing. So you did a great job with that.
Thanks,
Michael.
I appreciate that.
I
remember the day I wrote that, actually.
Oh.
And it was, I'm very fortunate to I live in Montana, the last house for about 60,000 acres. And I'm very fortunate to live in nature and be outdoors every day and see the progression of seasons on an hour by hour basis. And I remember that morning when there was very heavy dew on the fall grass, and you could see the grass bowed down from the weight of the dew. And you just had that sense that it was going down for one of the last times before the snows came and just buried it. But it was an evocative moment.
Mm-hmm. Coming from New Jersey and being a runner, I used to run along the boardwalk of the Jersey Shore, and I would notice that the wind would change. It was almost like on the clock. September 1st, the wind would shift from the north, and then it would be there for another 8-9 months. But it was like September 1st, things seemed to change. So I'm glad that's kind of a universal thing here in the States. Let's talk about the book now is been optioned, I guess, by Anonymous Content,
Right.
a very terrific company. I know because I was talking to them about one of their stars, Michael Imperioli, I think is rep by them. And they're talking about a series, or a TV series. I think this would be a terrific limited run TV series. It would be fantastic. So I hope that comes through. I know there's a lot of things to jump over there, but let's go back to your story. You wrote a couple of books, I think, and then you hit the home run with The Revenant. Was that a surprise to you? And then tell us about that journey, because it's not a big story, if you will. It was a character study and about two guys, going at it. And then all of a sudden you've got this movie and you've got DiCaprio in it, and you've got these super talented director, and you had the terrific screenwriting team and Tom Hardy, and you got all kinds of stuff going on. And then it becomes this monster hit. What was it like for you? And how did you get there?
Well, it was a very long journey, actually. I published that book, The Revenant, I sold it actually a couple of weeks after right before 9/11. Mm-hmm. And so in 2001, and the film was made in 2015. Right. And so it was a 14-year journey from the time of selling the book to actually the film being made. And in the meantime, I think like lots of projects in Hollywood, went through various stages of excitement and dormancy, including some long stages of dormancy. As you mentioned, Anonymous Content was really responsible for keeping the story alive. And it was Anonymous that brought Alejandro Iñárritu to the project as director. And it was really after he became attached that things started to happen more quickly. Most importantly, Leonardo DiCaprio coming on board to star as Hugh Glass. And then once Leo was on board, it felt like it happened very quickly, at least in the scheme of the 14 years that I'd been thinking about it. But it was a lot of ups and downs. I had kind of moved on with my career in a lot of ways. I'd written a couple of other books, a couple of screenplays, but I was living in Geneva, Switzerland, as you mentioned, working as U.S. ambassador to the World Trade Organization, when I got the call that that Leo was on board to be Hugh Glass, and it was a pretty exciting moment for sure. And events did take off after that.
When the book was originally launched, was it a hit, a bestseller right away, or was
No.
it kind of like because it happens, and it's not a slag, it's a compliment that it's good things to take time to be discovered often. And I know this is a 15-year journey for you. So kind of what happened with that? How did it kind of get hit where somebody said this could be a movie?
Yeah. So it was the first book that I had ever written. And I was, of course, thrilled to have it published. And like everybody trying to publish a first book, I spent months and months trying to find an agent. And then my agent spent months and months trying to sell the book. And then we finally sold it. And just that felt like a huge kind of thing to celebrate. But it got good reviews when it came out, but it was a book that was read primarily by my mother and her friends for a number of years. Fortunately, she's got quite a few friends, but I was happy for it to find a broader audience when the film was made. And obviously that made a huge difference in terms of it. The book had gone out of print and came back into print.
So how did that happen? That's my question. Because you launched it. It is it's a very specific story about these characters and based on truth and historical facts. The book didn't sell all that well. It was well reviewed because it's a terrific book. I read the book after I saw the movie, and I want to ask you about some of the changes that were made. And then what happened for that book to be discovered and somebody say, hey, this could be a film? Because it obviously they were right.
Yeah. Well, there was a guy at Anonymous Content who saw the film potential of the book early on and brought it to Anonymous, and then Anonymous had it inside of their company for almost a decade, I think, before all of the elements lined up. And it turned into a movie. So, and it, of course, so it was really Anonymous seeing the potential of the Revenant as a film, and then having patience over a very long period of time to wait until the right constellation of director, star, everyone else aligned to have it made. One thing that I was told early on is that if The Revenant ever got made into a movie, it would be with a very big star attached, because as you point out, it's so focused on, that story is so focused on one person. And I was told that for somebody to finance that type of a film in Hollywood would only happen if it was around somebody big. And it might never get made, but if it did ever get made, it would be made around a big star. And that's how it ended up happening. Is as I mentioned, Iñárritu came on as director. He attracted DiCaprio as a star, and with DiCaprio, it got made and ended up doing pretty well.
Now, you have written some screenplays. Did you take a swing at doing an adaptation on your own? Did that, and if so, did that get handed over? And then you had all the Hollywood people start pulling it apart? Because as you know, writing a screenplay is a different animal than a novel. The screenplay, it has to be on, it's going to be on the screen, and it has to be almost myopic in terms of the story.
I did not write the screenplay for The Revenant. And at the time that we first optioned it, I had never written a screenplay. And I think the experience that a lot of people find is you can't sell a screenplay until you've sold a screenplay, the catch-22 of screenwriting. And I had never written a screenplay, and they hired somebody else to do that. It ended up being a great guy named Mark Smith, who wrote the screenplay for The Revenant. He is a wonderfully collaborative person, by the way, who was kind enough to involve me along the way in terms of sharing drafts and asking, different historical questions and things like that. And so I was able to have that level of involvement just as a friend of Mark Smith, and with his, as I said, generous collaboration. But to be honest, it pissed me off that I couldn't write the screenplay, because I did feel like it was my story.
Sure.
And it motivated me to learn how to write screenplays, which I spent some time learning to do, and then was able to sell a couple of screenplays. I've never sold anything that's ultimately been produced, but enough to get into the Writers Guild, and to credibly be able to say, now, for example, with Ridgeline, that if there is going to be something made of this for TV or film, I want to be the person to write it. So, but that was a long process, including, taking a couple of years, obviously, to try and credibly learn the craft of writing screenplays, such that I could even make an effort to say that I would write it.
Okay.
That was the story there.
Okay. Did you attend the shoot at all? Did you meet any of the big players?
I was not able to attend the shoot, unfortunately. It was shot mostly in Canada, a little bit in Argentina, a little bit in Montana. And I was in Geneva, Switzerland that whole time, working for the US government, and just was not in a position to be able to take the time to travel and go on set. I did meet some of the people involved with the production, including DiCaprio, Iñárritu, in conjunction with the Golden Globes and the Oscars. So had that experience, which was a fun and great experience.
Were they cool?
They were great. It was fun. I had I won't pretend that I'm besties with DiCaprio or anything, but we had a very interesting conversation at the Golden Globes about the buffalo. Actually, he, as you know, is a big conservationist, and he had read another book that I wrote about the buffalo, and we talked about that. So it was fun and interesting.
Okay, let's just put a period on this just for a second. Why don't you take care of your dog, and then we'll finish this up.
Okay, hey, hold on.
All right, so Michael's gonna tend to his dog, and we're gonna keep going here on Guys Radio. And we're going to talk a little bit more about his two works. Ridgeline is the new book, and it's fantastic. And also we're talking about Revenant now, which was kind of a small book when it was launched, but you stick with it. It took 15 years. It became an Oscar-winning movie. So for all of you writers out there and aspiring screenwriters, you got to stick with it. You got to be in it to win it. It's like everything else, whether it's writing or being a podcast host or dating. If you're not in it, you're not going to win it. So and here's Michael coming back with his dog. Okay, I was expecting something. I was expecting a border collie or something like that.
No, this is a wolf doodle, I say.
A wolf doodle. Awesome. Okay, so what's next for you, Michael?
So I am, as you mentioned, very hopeful that we will get some traction with either TV or film adaptation of Ridgeline. It's obviously a story that I love and a project that I'm passionate about, and I would love to work on that. I intend to keep writing books, which I love to do. I love the excuse for doing historical research in a kind of organized way. So I think I will stick in the century that I'm in, the 19th century, and the region that I'm in, the American West, which to me is just full of so many compelling stories that it's made for storytelling.
Okay, where can our listeners and viewers find out more about you? Where can they pick up the book, etc.? Well,
I am an amateur of Twitter and Instagram at mpunke, M-P-U-N-K-E on Twitter, and at MWPUNKE on Instagram. And my kids don't think I'm very good at it, but I do put up a lot of pictures from my travels around the state of Montana. So if that's of any interest to people, there you have it.
And then bookstores, you can pick up Amazon or any of the bookstores for the book, or
Ridgeline is every place books are sold.
Fantastic. Well, listen, great job with the book. I'm like about more than halfway through it. I can't wait to find out what happens. I'm really engrossed and finding myself, who am I rooting for on in this section? And the book moves along very nicely because it switches perspectives. Awesome. You don't get, the reader doesn't get bogged down. You keep it moving. You can see what's going to happen, and it's not good for the cavalry. So anyhow, terrific job.
Thanks a lot.
Fantastic to meet you, and I'm so glad you were with us on Guys Radio. And good luck with this, making this into a TV series. It's going to be great.
Thanks, I appreciate it. Great to talk.
All right, be well.
Take care.
If you enjoy the guests and content we bring you each and every week here on Guys Radio and TV, then please support us by subscribing to our channels. Thank you.